button. Click. And we're live. It is Friday, December 10th, 2021, 5:02 p.m. in Washington, 5:02 p.m. in Brooklyn, probably 11:02 p.m. in Paris. Is that fair, Claire?
Yep.
Yeah. Which is to say it's a late night for Claire. We appreciate her staying up. She was asleep when we tried to get her on Bastille Day in November, but she is awake today. We are not allowed to have fun anymore, people, but we are allowed to keep people up late in Paris when they should be asleep, and welcome to them to the show. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you so much. So, what do you do here in lieu of fun?
Well, we it's in lieu of fun started at the beginning of the pandemic, when we
the pandemic in the United States.
Yeah, and I said to Kate that we should get together every day at 5 for a drink, and talk to somebody interesting, and have and do it online so that people could join us. It'd be kind of like happy hour, kind of like, I think we've done it basically every day since, until recently we were doing it 7 days a week, but now we do it 5 days a week. And this is the 564th episode of In Lieu of Fun. And here you are. Thomas Ilves suggested that we talk to you, which seemed like a great idea.
7 days a week? That's a hardcore
I
schedule.
actually kind of look back at this and in like partial, like I can't remember when I don't remember what my life was like when it was totally feasible for me to do 7 days a week of the show.
Well, don't you run out of things to say?
No,
because we have guests.
We have guests.
That's why you're here, so that we don't run out of things to say. For example, in 564 episodes, we have never once asked you what is the constitution of your menagerie of stray and rescue animals. We have done rescue animals on the show. Kate rescued a cormorant and a very large sea turtle and a baby chipmunk. But but you're the first guest whose bio says she has a menagerie of stray and rescue animals. So tell us who's in it.
Scratching her beautiful little face.
Cats right now, because it's been a bad few years for animals aging off of this mortal coil. But this is Zeki, and he's if you watch him for a while, you'll see that he has a strange vestibular condition that makes his head sort of screwed on wrong. But he's a cat, so he doesn't mind. He's not self-conscious about it. These two hate each other, as you can hear. We've got a cat fight going on right here.
Oh yeah, it's our first live cat fight on In Lieu of Fun.
Not really, Ben. Let's be honest.
Feline MA, FMA, and this is Sully. Sully's now quite an elderly gentleman, and he suffers from arthritis in his hips. So about 30 times a day, he comes over to the couch. This is Claire Central, the couch. This is where I've spent the last 2 years. Haven't really left it. And I lift him up and put him on the couch and put him back down, and lift him up and put him back down. And he's really pretty happy with this arrangement. He's realized he doesn't actually need to do any jumping at all. I'm happy to do it all for him.
That's very sweet.
Here on this couch.
So I have a very ancient, blind, deaf, and probably arthritic. Who knows? Like, she doesn't move around a lot either. Cocker Spaniel that it makes a frequent appearance on the show. But I love all animals. So
are all the members of the menagerie cats?
As of now, yes. Yes. He was from a litter of 5 that I found all at once.
Oh my God!
Wow.
I found him.
Wow.
So there is another subject which in 564 episodes of In Lieu of Fun we have never once discussed, and that is the Cosmopolitan Globalist. And I think we should break that streak, and you should tell us all about it.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so I was sitting on this couch, it was a pandemic, and I had been here for.
You need it a little bit closer to the microphone, just a little bit. There you go.
Good. Because I'd been pretty solidly glued to the couch for about 4 months. I hadn't done anything, and my life was really just becoming Twitter. And one of the kind of constant complaints on Twitter, me and my journalist friends would see some really badly written article about the country in which we lived, because I've got journalist friends all over the world, because I've been a journalist all over the world for like the last 30 years. We'd see a really badly written article and we'd complain about it. And then one day I said impulsively, hey, why don't we do something instead of complaining about it? Why don't we start a news and analysis publication that meets our standards of professional excellence? And somehow, because everyone was trapped at home and had nothing better to do, we actually, instead of just saying, why don't we do this, we actually did it. We got about 60 odd people together working on this project to start a news and analysis magazine, or actually we're calling it a platform now because it's going to be more than a magazine, that compensates for the complete decline of foreign news coverage, of foreign journalism in the entire Anglosphere media. Because I don't know whether you've noticed, a lot of people just haven't noticed, but there is no more foreign news coverage in the United States. It's just gone. It was at the height of the Cold War, about 40% of the news hole was foreign news coverage, and now it's less than 4%. 80% of the print news coverage is gone. It's just gone. And there's this huge gap where it used to be.
So how does it work? What's the you have I mean, that's a large group of people. Where are they dispersed among? And you're running it as a Substack. Who's editing it? How does, who do you have writing for it? What are you guys doing?
All right. So my co-editor, Vivek, is in Mumbai. And he and I are sort of basically the only two full-time people, along with our web designer, Amanpreet, and our podcast host, Monique. We're completely volunteer for now. I mean, everyone's doing this out of love, out of a sense that it really needs to be done. But we want to make it professional. And we've really enjoyed working on it, and we really do think that someone needs to be doing this because no one else is. And the old model for foreign news coverage is never coming back. So we need to
Right.
figure something new out. But it can't go on, Americans getting no news from overseas ever, or what they get, and what they get is ridiculous. All right, I think the story that infuriated me so much that we began this is, if you heard about this at all, you might have heard that there was a police shooting in France, because that's what the headline was. Actually, the headline, police shooting in France, was referring to a story in which a school teacher was beheaded in broad daylight by a jihadi. And the New York Times thought the key point of the story was that it was a police shooting. So it was the kind of thing where you just look at it and you know what the story is, and you see the way it's reported, and you're thinking, they've got to get someone in France to cover a story like this, because they've missed the point in such a big way it's not even funny.
And what is there other than improving the quality and having a distributed bunch of people all over the world, is there a sensibility that binds it together? Is it like lawfare? We do national security law, right? Is there a political or philosophical sensibility, or is it just like, we want to bring you better foreign news coverage?
No, we definitely have a shared sensibility. We definitely feel that Enlightenment, 18th century Enlightenment values are under threat around the world, and under threat in very similar ways. That people aren't aware of because they're not getting foreign news. But we're anti-populist, we're rationalist, we believe in free speech, free markets, the things that everyone used to believe in, but now are under threat everywhere.
Well, I'm a little curious. Like, it would strike me as actually, if you're like in like kind of in 18th century kind of beliefs of kind of like of enlightenment, that of course there was really poor coverage of foreign events, like for audiences at that time, and that there wasn't like, and I'm not like saying that that you're saying differently, but I'm curious, like, what is the golden age of foreign, so to speak, or like journalism that you're kind of like hearkening back to?
Well, the golden age of journalism for the United States certainly was during the Cold War, when the U.S. had massively funded huge bureaus around the world and set the international news agenda and fed all the wires, and even small town newspapers sent foreign correspondents abroad because it was prestigious, and they didn't realize that it wasn't profitable because people were buying a single item, the newspaper, and they weren't able to disaggregate the sports section from the comics from the stock market page. So they were buying a whole package, and editors sincerely believed they were reading the foreign news. As soon as
it was adorable of them, wasn't it?
But even if you just go back to the 1970s and read the New York Times, you see that it's just a vastly more sophisticated product. It's better written, it's better edited, and the foreign correspondents, they weren't 22-year-old ingenues. They were really good at what they did.
Although there were some, I want to say there were some foreign correspondents who, when I was at the Washington Post, there were some foreign correspondents who were remarkably young and fabulous. I mean, and so I do think I largely agree with your point that there was just a culture of reporting foreign news that was, but it wasn't all grizzled old people who would have otherwise been CIA analysts, sort of pipe smoking. There was a lot of, kind of gritty young people who were on the make, which was great.
Well, Vivek and I know each other because we both started our careers at Asia Times in Bangkok, which was full of exactly the character you just described. Grizzled old.
Which one? Grizzled old reporters who otherwise would have been CIA people?
We couldn't figure out how else this place was funded. It wasn't like anyone ever actually read what we wrote.
All right, so who do you have? Right before I get to your title, which I want to talk about the words Cosmopolitan Globalist, because I can't figure out if you decided to call your publication Jewish Jew for ironically or for some other reason. But before we get there, I want to ask. See, Kate, I told you she would know what I was talking about.
I know. Well, I never. Okay, sorry, Claire. Before you came on, Ben was like, "Those two words are code for like what you call Jews," and I was like, no one knows that.
For goodness sake, it's not code. It's like famous anti-Semitic slur.
This is exactly what Ben said. And I was like, okay. And so, sorry. This is like half of this show, just so you know, Claire, is like Ben describing to a genetically Jewish person that like
Kate's the most genetically Jewish shiksa in the world.
It's really true. And I have no idea about any of this. And so I was like, well, let's give her, I don't know, maybe she didn't mean it like that. And Ben's like, no, she totally, knows what this means. And I'm like, I've never heard that before. I'm 37. And, this is the first time. And Ben's like...
We're going to get...
Funny thing, he didn't know it either. And he went along with this for months without realizing what the name we'd chosen meant. And he's from Mumbai. Why would he know this?
See,
So
I'm not from Mumbai. I'm from Rochester, New York. It's like the same thing.
all right, we're going to get to the Jewish Jew title. But before we do, you have 68 people writing for this.
More or less. I mean, we've had more people who have expressed an interest and sort of dropped off the horizon. Fewer people who have been core people, but it was about 68 at one point.
Yeah, so tell us about who these people are and where you've got coverage.
Well, we've had some really good pieces from Vivek's done a terrific job covering Asia. We've got India, we've got Southeast Asia, we've got someone working on North Korea, not in North Korea, but working on North Korea from Southeast Asia. We've had a terrific piece from a Venezuelan who's in exile in the United States and Venezuela. We've got Germans, we've got a Russian. I wouldn't say Russians, we've got a Russian. And who else do we have? We have a couple of anonymous correspondents who don't like to be named, but who have reported from Mexico City. And, we've got Israelis. We've got, what else we have? We have a Slovenian.
And all of these people are reporting from their from the countries in which they're from.
Or, well, there are some people who are reporting on other countries because it's not very hospitable to report from North Korea.
Right.
It would be cool to get them to report from North Korea, but I don't know if we would be able to protect them.
And what is the subject matter that's within scope for you guys? I mean, the Cosmopolitan Globalist, reporter in Slovenia is covering, like, what in Slovenia is within scope for you guys, like Slovenian domestic politics? Is that?
But we're looking for stories that have a genuinely global significance. We're not necessarily interested in, well, I mean, we might be interested in a story about rubbish bins in Slovenia if it's relevant, if it's something that everyone in the world can read and think, well, that is somehow relevant to problems of local governance in my corner of the world. But our remit is genuinely global. The stories, we did a series on energy, for example, I thought was really, really good. We had a really good debate about the best way to provide energy for all 7.8 billion people in the world. Keeping in mind, we have the perspective of people who are coming from developing countries who would like to continue developing. We have the perspective of people who come from island nations who would like not to be flooded. But I thought it was a really good discussion. And that's the kind of issue we want to treat, genuinely global issues. I think there are a common set of challenges. The Summit for Democracy has received almost no news coverage, which I find very interesting. It's this big event, but it's not being written up. But a lot of the things the participants have been talking about are the things we're also concerned about. There are some common challenges to all 140 nations that purport to be democracies right now.
Yeah, but so, like, do you find... So I think that this is like a fascinating way to kind of tell this story, which I actually really, really love. You don't know me at all, but I'm a law professor by trade, and I do a lot of writing about social. I'm a journalist also, and I do social media stuff, and like my work is on social media, like the study of the platforms in particular. But like one of the things that I really love is that during the pandemic, I went and lived in Cape Cod, where my parents have a house, and we kind of escaped there out of Brooklyn. And they have a very small print newspaper that comes out once a week called the Provincetown Independent that serves like, and it's all, one of the things that I had forgotten was that like basically all local news is land use hearings and like kind of conversations about how land is being used and regulations around land. And it ended up being this tremendous, like it's something that we don't have also in Brooklyn because it's such a large metropolitan, cosmopolitan area that like like you find it, but it's not really quite the same. And so like now I have like this wonderful, I still subscribe to this paper, and like, but it has incredible application, even though it's in this tiny remote seafaring village that's tourist-based population and economy that is like seasonal, that it has tremendous overlay into like everything that I teach and everything that I do, even in like this. So I really love that idea. Do you think that it's that kind of one-to-one with what you're trying to kind of show people, and that in that sense you're kind of leveling problems across different types of populations and democracies?
Yes, definitely. We're not the only country that's having a few problems with democracy right now. And there are many things we could be learning from other countries that are struggling with the same problems. But because there's so little coverage of it, I think that Americans still don't realize that what they're experiencing is by no means exceptional. It's really part of a global pattern. I mean, they may have heard this, but it's not very real to them because it's part of the global democratic recession, as they're putting it. Yeah, it's an interesting question. Why should so many democracies be experiencing the same problems all at once?
All right, so I want to ask you about the name. The name, I have 3 possible theories about the name, and I'm curious which one is right, and or if they're all wrong. So theory number 1 is that you're basically tweaking or trying to tweak the people who believe that, interest in overseas affairs is kind of rootless cosmopolitanism, or as Bannon likes to say, globalism, and the sort of the province of George Soros and the international Jew. And this is kind of a tweak at this and say, hey, we got people all over the world who are actually really cosmopolitan globalists, meaning they're cosmopolitan, i.e. they think about things all over the place, and they're globalists. They believe in knowing about the globe. That's theory number 1, possibility number 1. Theory number 2 is it's actually a reference to the way people talk about you. You've got a name that's obviously Jewish name, and I'm sure you've had your share of anti-Semitic trolls saying, oh, Claire Berlinski, that fucking cosmopolitan globalist. And so you've just kind of named it after yourself, probably along with a bunch of your writers. And the third possibility is, which I now know to be false, is that Kate was right, and that the name was was chosen unironically because you said, oh, maybe what we need now is some cosmopolitan globalism. And so we'll have a public...
Why are you both laughing so hard? Like those words mean something outside.
I know, but they're not the specific word that the person who would have done it unironically would have chosen, at least in my view. But Claire could prove me wrong. So which of those 3 is actually the origin of the site, or is it something completely different?
Actually, it's option 4. All the other domain names were taken already.
Voila.
I love that shit. That's exactly right.
Trying to find domain names that weren't taken already, and this was like the only thing that was remotely related to what we were doing that wasn't taken, and I guess no one else wanted to be called a Cosmopolitan Globalist for some reason.
Yeah, I can't imagine why.
That sounds like a group that I'd put together at Yale Law School, frankly. And I would have no idea that other people were joining it.
Okay, let's find out from the audience whether Kate's view of this is actually reasonable.
No, everyone's going to tell me that I'm unreasonable, Ben. We've done this type of thing before. Oh my God.
How
long have you been in Claire?
About 7 years now. Before that, I was in Turkey for about 10 years.
Awesome, great. Well, I spent like 3-4 months in Montpellier when I went. Yeah, it was beautiful for before I went on the teaching market, and it was some of the 4 best months of my life, and I literally wept when the plane took off from Paris. It was just like a really lovely time.
Provincial town. It's so it's as sophisticated as Paris almost, but it's southern.
Exactly. So it was just like a perfect, like I could take a tram to the beach and I could go to the mountains and I could it was a really lovely way to spend a couple of months. Okay, Ben wrote his poll. How am I going to vote?
All right, there's the poll. We're going to see whether. Oh, so Kate's faring pretty well here. A lot of people going with they didn't previously know that this title could be read ironically.
Can I actually ask, is there a specific time in history or reference point that those words came to mean that? Or like, what is it?
Stalin.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so the two different words at different times, right? So Claire, why don't you give us the history of the word cosmopolitan in reference to anti-Semitism?
Yeah, I mean it's the charge is the rootless cosmopolitan, the Jew who has no deep connection to any place and whose allegiances are to international Jewry as opposed to the country to which she should properly have be allied. And well, globalist has really made its way into its own recently. I mean that it's become almost synonymous with Jew and right-wing circles.
Yeah, so I think like
I thought globalist was about being like pro-immigration, like literally, and like
it is, but pro-immigration in the sense of the Great Replacement theory, right? The George Soroses of the world are importing lots of brown people so that you, the white person, lose your job, right? That's the.
That all of the time, I think that it's really. I would like to say thank you, Ben, for always being the one that teaches me all of these terrible words and names and like ideas about Jewishness. I would like to say that this is a sign I have really good friends and I choose my friends well, that I've never come into contact with these philosophies at all.
So Toy Tanks makes an important point actually in the chat, which I think is worth fleshing out. The term globalist has a non-anti-Semitic meaning. In fact, that's like the
Tom Friedman meaning of
globalist. That's its normal meaning. But there's a sense in which Steve Bannon uses the word that is laced with anti-Semitism, which is, so like a globalist is at some level the opposite of a nationalist, right? Or what we used to call an internationalist, right? And in that sense, the word is simply descriptive. But then there's like when Steve Bannon says, we're talking about globalists, what he means is George Soros, and that's international Jews. And the word cosmopolitan actually has the same history, which is the Soviet state was formally anti-Semitic, right? It was very formally egalitarian, and but in fact Stalin was, particularly in his older years, was virulently anti-Semitic, and most of the late purges, the last purge, the Doctor's Plot, was all about killing Jews. Yeah. And so you couldn't say we're going after people because they're Jews, because that actually defied the Soviet sort of Marxist egalitarianism. And so they used these code words that suggested overseas allegiances, and one of those words was cosmopolitan, which meant essentially the same thing that globalism means today. Is that a fair historical account?
Yeah, it also showed up quite a bit in Nazi propaganda, the same idea.
But the Nazis were much less afraid of just saying Jew.
Yeah, they had
a racist view of the world, whereas the Soviets had this ethos that was, that leaned toward the code word, because you couldn't actually just say a Jew can never be a good member of the Communist Party. You could just say a cosmopolitan can never be a true patriot. And then it turns out all the people that you mean by that are Jews.
Yeah, well, you see the same thing in for example, Louis Streicher pamphlets in the Stürmer, with you've got the Jew with his tentacles all around the world, and now you get the same illustrations with the word globalist in the same place.
Really? That's this is also just this is a Jack Balkin, famed Yale Law School professor and also mentor of mine and friend of the show, is coming out on Monday. But this is also, he's also Jewish, and this also adds a lot of color to a long talk we once had in which he said that, do you remember the airport like protests that happened during the Trump, like,
you mean after the travel ban?
Yeah, after the travel ban, the airport protests. And Jack, I was finishing my PhD at the time, and Jack was just basically like, I was at Yale, and he was like, this is because the world is cosmopolitan, and like actually it has become, the airports are the center of cosmopolitan globalism. And I never even put together in any way that was like, he was also drawing from like his like kind of, anyways, now this like is making these words make a different layer of meaning that I totally missed in the first telling of this. But this has been fascinating. I'm really sorry for being so ignorant about this. Kind of. I'm guessing like really sorry for not being aware of the slurs on your people. Like, I'm just like...
You know, it's all right. We it's just a very, very funny title. And I love it. So here is my now we have a million great audience questions right now, so I want to go to audience questions momentarily, but I want to ask because I want to subscribe, what is the name of the podcast?
Our podcast? I mean, okay, well, first of all, you can find the Cosmopolitan Globalist at www.cosmopolitanglobalist.com. You can also subscribe on our Substack, same name, and our podcast is the Cosmopolicast.
The Cosmopolicast?
Cosmopolicast, but we don't have a URL for it. You have to find it on our website.
All right. So that is. So let's go to audience questions. I'm gonna just invite people on, and whoever shows up first gets the first question. Because all the questions are good today.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the image.
All right, Christopher Argyris. This is London speaking to Paris. Yeah. The floor is yours, sir.
Okay. Hi, Claire. So I don't know if you remember, about 10 years ago, there was this social media honeypot spy affair with the account Primoris Era, and you wrote about that.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. So I linked the article. People haven't read it, but so I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts, like a decade on, about government agencies, defense contractors, and other private companies using similar operations to gather intel or gain market advantage? Because I remember you said at the time that you'd written a spy novel.
Yeah.
Lying Eyes, so it had similar kind of themes. So
I really have not given that case any thought since you read that article. So I don't have any up-to-date thoughts about that. Trying to remember what the details of it were. It involved, I mean, it now seems really early social media, doesn't it? Now we're really used to the idea of people on social media not being what we think they are. But that was sort of early days when I think we were all a lot more naive and much more willing to believe that people to whom we spoke on social media were exactly who they said they were. Now I don't think that.
Michael Nelson, the floor is yours.
Hi, Michael.
Good to hear from you and learn more about what you're doing. I had two questions, and maybe that the answer to both questions is no. But the first question was whether you've seen this new movie, French Dispatch,
no.
About an American small-town newspaper that sets up a bureau in Paris. So I recommend it highly. The other one is, have you read the book On Tyranny by Timothy Snyder? And you mentioned authoritarianism in the 20th century in Europe, and I'm curious whether you were as impressed by the book as I was, and whether he missed anything. Is there anything?
I thought he was dead on. I thought he was dead on. And, I lived through the Erdogan years in Turkey, from the beginning of his time in power to the time I left, at which point it was pretty obvious this was a full-fledged authoritarian regime. So I saw the entire thing. And I think anyone who's lived through that, anyone who's studied that, understands that some of the things we saw during the Trump era were deeply disturbing and part of an international, well-established pattern. So I think he was absolutely right to be as alarmed as he was and to point these things out.
How did you come to be living in Turkey?
I had a boyfriend there. I was dating a guy there, and then we broke up, and I was still living there. But by that time, I was really in love with Istanbul. I mean, it's just one of the great.
Istanbul's just one of the great cities in the world.
One of the great cities of the world, if not the great city of the world. And it's also just fascinating. It's just so interesting, and there was so much going on politically, stuff I'd never seen before. I would never lived through an authoritarian takeover. And so I stayed, and I stayed as long as I could, but until I really felt it wasn't safe for journalists to be there anymore. Certainly not for me to be there anymore.
Tim Smith, the floor is yours.
Hi, I'm actually probably one of Claire's most frequent commenters on this site. So I've been on a little fun before too. This doesn't fit my work schedule as much as it used to. So
change your work schedule.
I know.
Quit your job, do whatever it takes, but don't drop off in lieu of fun. We expect our audience to organize their lives around in lieu of fun, and I understand that you may not think it's that much of a priority, but you're wrong.
Well, my question was, and this is something I've never thought I actually asked Claire before, but is the news coverage in kind of what I would think of as like the traditional French media in France, Le Monde, Le Figaro, whatever the France television, has it changed too, in the sense do they still have like a traditional level of coverage that they did back in the 80s or 70s, or has their coverage dropped off
French
as
news
well?
Coverage of global affairs is significantly better than Anglophone coverage. It's if you pick up a French newspaper, it will have the ratio of foreign to domestic news that we used to have in Anglophone papers. And I noticed this in particular when I was reading French coverage of the American election. And I was thinking, it's really good coverage. It's as good as any American newspaper in terms of its insight and the quality of its writing. But it's not a bilateral relationship. You don't get U.S. coverage of a French election. It's even remotely in the same ballpark of quality. And you could say, well, everyone puts their best correspondence in the United States because it's still a really important country, if not probably the most important country. But there is something so strange about the asymmetry of it that really struck me, that everyone knows so much more about us than we do about the world.
That's so true.
All right. So the ultimate cosmopolitan globalist is now on screen, Alex Manovich. And I'm just going to reveal something
what do you
about
mean by that?
I'm about to tell you. You want to talk about the wandering Jew. Alex Manovich grew up in a family, he's going to not contradict me because this is true, 4 members of his household, 4 different citizenships of birth.
Yeah.
Is that correct, Alex?
That is true. That is true.
One Canadian.
At one point, we probably would have been traveling. Yeah. Traveling on 4 different passports at some point.
One Canadian, 1 American, 1 Argentinian, 1 Uruguayan. This is Jewish America in the Jewish post-1924 immigration, right?
Yeah, well, even pre, but yeah. All
right. See, Steve Bannon, Alex,
to my
he's coming for you. You are the globalist.
I
and you have a globalism question for Claire.
Well, no, I mean, this is a little self-serving, I guess. But I've been living in, I was born in Canada, but I grew up in Boston. I moved to Toronto right after college, so I've been here now for almost 30 years. And I found personally that I identify much more as Canadian at this point. And so that was kind of my question to you was, to what extent do you still identify as American? After I don't know exactly how long you've been abroad, but it sounds like it's 20 years-ish. Whether that has changed over time and whether that experience is kind of typical or what other people's experience has been, the people that you know.
Well, I grew up in the US and I've been living overseas mostly since my 20s, but the imprinting is all completely American. And my instinctive first reactions to everything are and always will be American. The problem is that they're American circa 1990. And that's not the same thing as what it is to be American now. So I have a time warp feeling whenever I'm looking at America or thinking about America. I'm thinking this is all wrong. This doesn't make any sense. This is not what America is. This isn't the way we're supposed to be acting. And I can't get my head around the degree to which our country has changed. So I am an exile, but it's an exile of time rather than of space. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense. I think that makes complete sense. I mean, this is also the generational gaps in America right now. I think that they're really profound. So like, yeah.
A lot of people say the same thing to me. I think you imprint on the age when you're in your early 20s, and that's your standard for the rest of your life. Think that you are in your early 20s and you believe that everyone else is the same way they were then too.
We've had this conversation on the show in various forms, but I think that that's right. And I think that there's also like an imprinting. And then I also think that there is a period of history that like is too recent to be taught in school and in which you were too young to actually remember going through it for your own country. That like is probably 10 years before you and like 10 years like of your first 10 years of life in which like you just don't really have a sense of like what was really happening then and how it shaped things. That I think is like a big gap in like kind of collective intelligence, right? Like I don't know anything about really I don't remember anything instinctively about a Reagan presidency, like at all.
Oh, yeah, I remember the Reagan era pretty well, but I'm thinking
right. Like I know what I've seen in like media and what I've read in history books now, but like we never got to Reagan when I was taking history class because it was too recent. Frankly, we barely got to the Vietnam War, and like then like there was so there were does that make sense? Like there just wasn't like I was born during Reagan.
It took a really long time to figure out that something was wrong in America. That things were not. It wasn't going well. And
when did you figure that out?
Yeah, I'm curious.
When Trump won the
I was going to say, like, when we all figured it out.
Right, no. But I mean, there are these certain people who figured it out earlier than that.
Yeah.
And there are people who figured it out late. I think the moment at which all reasonable people figured it out was the fall of 2016. But you don't feel like you had either an advantage or disadvantage in assessing it by being abroad in that period of time, sort of looking at it from a distance?
I think I had a disadvantage. I think I was just working off of a mental model that was obsolete. And one that was particularly disadvantaged because my last memories of the U.S. were roughly the time the Berlin Wall came down, a moment of total American triumphalism and optimism. And I just didn't assimilate any of the economic changes or the polarization or the deep sense of resentment and frustration that seemed to be building up in a great many Americans. I was oblivious. I was rethinking about other things. I was observing these phenomena in Turkey, and I just wasn't paying attention. And it felt pretty stupid when I realized.
As did we all. Paula, the floor is yours. And Paula generously agreed to be Aliced so that we did not, the shot did not cut Claire in half as it does when we have 3 people on screen. I specifically asked Paula's permission to bring her on screen and leave her there so that we would have 4 panes instead of 3.
So yeah, my question is, do you think that there's just a dearth of interest in the US market for international news? So is the lack of news leading to this, like you pointed it out, like lack of competency in international affairs, or is it vice versa? And I can like say from like personal experience, I remember growing up and telling people I was Lebanese and they would say, oh, you're lesbian. That no, they just had never heard of a Lebanese person or the place.
And did you respond to that? No, Lebian.
No. But I mean, it was just such an interesting experience growing up that like people had no idea that my parents were born in another country that they just didn't know existed.
I think, how old are you? Because I think
she's 22.
Right.
Or
I think
12.
When I was growing up, people would have associated with it with bombings and terrorism, at least. I mean, they would have had a negative association, but they would have at least had a sense of.
They would have had an association, right?
Yeah, and the Marine barracks bombing, that they would have had some associations with. I think the sense of I don't even realize that's a country. That's pretty new. That's part of the growing insularity and the lack of information coming into the United States from abroad. The question, is it because there's no demand that there's no news, or is it because there's no news that there's no demand? It's a really good question. I think it's both. It goes both ways. There wasn't that much of a demand before, but people didn't realize there wasn't a demand. And editors asked for it because it was important and prestigious for your newspaper to have global news coverage, and because they thought it was good for people to read it. And then with the transformation in journalism such that all the pieces of the newspaper could be disaggregated, they realized, okay, people aren't clicking on these foreign stories, so we can't afford this. We can't justify it in the budget anymore. And that has certainly encouraged people to forget that a wider world exists. So they don't demand foreign news coverage.
When I went to college, many of the things I had never heard of the United Arab Emirates before. And I met someone from there, and I remember them saying, like, I'm from the UAE, and I was like, the U a what? Like, I literally was like, is that like I like remember and this is very funny for everyone who knows that I misunderstood the spelling of Weber when I was in graduate school, but I mistyped UAE as like YOO. Like I was like, oh, a country named UAE. Like, no, not at all. Anyways, so hi, Richard.
Richard Wattenbarger, the floor is yours.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
It wasn't an important story.
So,
go ahead before Richard asks his question. Sorry.
Okay. So this guy I knew in college was dating a girl. He just wasn't that crazy about her, but they went out to a disco and they had flashing strobe lights and really loud noise, and he was enamored with it. And he said, "I love you, V," and you can imagine what she heard. He had to disappear for a month. He could completely disappear. All right, so
wait, what's UV?
Ultraviolet.
Ultraviolet.
Oh, okay, that's what I thought. That's what I thought you meant. Oh, I love you. Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, also I'm a little slow, so it's maybe not.
Did her name start with V?
No, it was just like, she's in a disco with this guy and she's really into him, but he's not really. And he says, "I love you, V," and then the next thing you know, he has to go into hiding.
Richard Wattenbarger, who also has to go into hiding because of his propensity to listen.
Oh my God! Don't say it.
Sorry. All right, I won't say it. Richard, the floor is yours.
I hadn't been listening to that guy for a long time until we started having this little feud. So
it's
so there.
Bruckner Claire. That's like the whole joke. They're that dirty. Anyways, go ahead, Richard.
So I've watched in recent years as my friends, especially in the UK, have been, sat by and watched Brexit happen and been all distressed about that, and then I've seen the rise of Marine Le Pen and so on. But I'm curious that to what extent do you find that people in today's France still identify as European in more than just a geographical sense, that they subscribe to a notion of a sort of a European or maybe a Western European polis or unity?
Well, we're going to find out in the coming presidential election because it's going to be a big issue. I mean, Macron is definitely trying to style himself as Mr. Europe. And France as the leading cultural military power in Europe, and especially now with the UK out. But his view is, okay, Europe should be a vehicle for French power projection, and Europe should be a counterweight to the US and China. And he's up against, it looks like Zemmour is doing very well. I don't know if he's going to continue to do well, but both Zemmour and Le Pen are obviously not enamored of this vision and do not see Europe as being an appropriate French project. And then we've got the new conservative candidate, Valérie Pécresse, who has a somewhat different vision of Europe, but we don't know that much about it because she's still quite unfamiliar to us. And I don't know whether I don't know how she's going to disambiguate herself from Macron, but it might be on the issue of Europe. She might have a different vision of it. But Macron is definitely, and I think he will be reelected. I strongly think he'll be reelected, but he is Mr. Europe. So if the electorate agrees with him, then I guess you can say the French still feel that they're European.
And how do you assess Zemmour? I mean, he seems like kind of in some ways worse than either of the Le Pens. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would. Well, worse than Le Pen. It's kind of a competition with no bottom. I mean, they're all vile. The Le Pens are vile, and he's vile. But they're kind of vile in a known quantity way, and he's vile in a novel way.
This strikes me as very sorry, doesn't this strike you as Trumpian and as Berlusconi and no, not?
Well, he's a much more sophisticated character than Trump. He's articulate. He's a good debater. He presents a much more flattering version of France back at itself than Trump does of the U.S.
Interesting.
So who would you compare him to? Is he a Neil Farage character? What's his, if you had to explain to him, to an American audience by analogy, how we should understand Zemmour, what are we talking about?
Maybe someone like Sohrab Ahmani, someone who's a little more slick, but who's really a sinister person. Someone who really seems to believe things that decent people wouldn't espouse, wouldn't believe. I mean,
so what in your judgment are the top three things that he espouses apparently with actual conviction that he really believes that are
is really grotesque. I mean, he's really a Vichy apologist, and his enthusiasm for the idea of deporting Muslims from France is really disturbing. I mean, no one should be saying deportation in a country like this. It has the history it has. And then the odor of violence that surrounds him. And he had a big rally out in Villepin last weekend, and it just evolved into a complete brawl with his followers.
Was this the video that I saw of a woman being punched repeatedly in the face?
Yeah. I mean, his followers are men who punch women. This is not nice. You don't want people like that around you. It doesn't speak well of you if you inspire that.
And what's his background?
He's a Jew from he's from Algeria, from a Pied Noir background. You know, his family came to France after the war, in the wake of decolonization, I think, and he seems to be someone who has compensated for some kind of insecurity by deciding he's going to be more French than the French and more anti-Semitic than the anti-Semites. And he's a well-known television commentator. He's on a channel called C News, which is like-wing to Fox, and that it's very right-wing. And he's written a couple of best-selling books. And he seems to have tapped into something, a sense in the right that the Le Pens aren't going to take them where they want to go.
And so, how do you expect him to? Do you expect him to? I assume he'll make the second round. Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I think it's going to be Pécresse versus Macron. I think the right is going to consolidate behind her because she's just a much more serious candidate.
She was the candidate when I was there in the summer of 2018, I guess. So yeah, it was. No, that was summer of 2017. Yeah, she was. It was right. It was following Trump, and she was having her moment, and like her face was all over billboards, and it was. Yeah, it was also a very weird time to be in the south of France for that reason. Like it was an incredibly. Like a lot of I actually experienced like outright racism that I would never have heard ever in New York, or frankly I don't think it would have happened in the United States. But I would go to a bar and I would someone would say like, oh, where are you from? And I would say Brooklyn in French, and then they would say like, oh, I'd be standing next to a black person that was also at the bar, and they'd say something like, oh, you must be used to this because you're from Brooklyn. And I was like, we used to what? And they're like, black people. And I was like what? Like what is this? Like I just literally never it was a very Southern French culture was very very strong and very different than even Southern American culture as we kind of think of it, I think. So
well, so I would have said, but I'm realizing there's a lot about American culture I didn't understand and that I was never exposed to when I was growing up. I came from a sheltered background as you did, and I just didn't know the kind of people who would say things like that. But I now realize there was a lot of America I just never knew. And an old boyfriend of mine, Turkish actually, who spent about 10 years in America, we were talking about this, and he told me about hearing. He had dated a girl from the South, and he told me about hearing the most vile kind of anti-Semitism and stuff that I'd never heard when I was growing up, and racism. And he'd obviously had a different experience of America than I did, and I thought, I don't know what kind of lowlifes you were hanging out with, but now I see that there are actually a lot of lowlifes in America that I just never knew about.
Yeah, I also think as you get older, you become attuned to it. Like you don't if these words don't make sense to you, if cosmopolitan globalist doesn't make sense to you, or code for something, no one's taught you that, no one's ever whispered to you that that's what it is, then it just passes over you and you never develop an antenna for those types of moments. Whereas if you're attuned to something and it's made clear, I think that Paula was on before saying that she was, the lesbian Lebanese type of thing. That would never be clear unless you actually were presenting as Lebanese to somebody and had that type of interaction. Otherwise, you have no cause to understand it. But this is part of the allure of globalism in the non-Jewish sense, but also in the Jewish sense. Go Jews. Yeah.
We are going to leave it there. Claire Berlinski, it's crazy that we have never met before.
I like you a lot, Claire. Come hang out in New York anytime you want.
It's great to meet you in person, or in what passes for in person. Thanks to President Ilves for suggesting that we have you on. And despite your living in France, as we say to our guests, you're a great American, and come back soon. We're going to leave it there. We're going to leave it there, except that you should subscribe to the Cosmopolitan Globalist on Substack, which I just did, and you all should too. It says it has hundreds of subscribers right there on the on the Substack. You can make that 100 more if you all do it. We will be back a lot of hours from now with some guest who will dredge up from somewhere.
No, it's Jack Balkin.
Oh, with Jack Balkin,
he's going to be talking about the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court. So
who's going to be talking about the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court? And that'll be a lot of hours from now, because we don't do 7 days a week anymore. But until then, KK,
we don't have fun anymore. But we do have France.
We do have France. Claire, a pleasure.
So nice to meet you.
Thanks for staying up. You're up way too late. Go to bed.
That was genuinely fun, not just in lieu of fun. But it was genuinely fun.
Don't tell anyone. We try to keep that on the DL. But yes,
we'll
whisper it